I stood there, still in my black suit from the funeral, gripping my mother's old silver locket in my hand. The house was silent except for the ticking of the antique clock she had always cherished, our family's legacy, one of the last things she had left behind. My eyes were burning, my throat raw from holding back the weight of grief that had settled deep inside me. But even in my worst nightmares, I hadn't expected what came next. Bianca was waiting for me in the living room, her arms crossed, an amused smirk playing on her lips. A row of suitcases stood neatly by the door. My suitcases. Finally, she sighed dramatically, rolling her eyes. I was starting to think you'd never come home. I blinked at her, my mind still fogged from the funeral, from burying the only woman who had ever truly loved me. What? Her smirk widened, a cruel glint in her eyes. Oh, don't act so surprised, Vincent. You had to know this was coming. She gestured toward the door with a lazy flick of her manicured fingers. You don't live here anymore. The words hung in the air like a slap. I just stared at her, my pulse pounding in my ears. Excuse me. Bianca sighed, as if this was all some minor inconvenience for her. She stepped closer, tilting her head as she looked at me like I was something pitiful, something beneath her. This house, our house, is mine now. You need to pack up whatever little things you have left and go. A slow, icy dread crawled down my spine. I glanced at the suitcases. My clothes, my books, my personal things. She had packed them all up without so much as a conversation. Bianca, I said carefully, trying to keep my voice steady. This was my mother's house. You don't have the right to. She laughed. Actually laughed. God, Vincent, you really are as pathetic as she said you were. Her voice dripped with condescension, her perfectly painted nails tapping against her wrist. Your mother is gone. And guess what? Everything she had, every single thing, now belongs to me. Do you think she'd ever leave anything to you? A man who spent his life covered in sawdust, fixing old furniture? No, Vincent. She knew who the real winner was in this marriage. I clenched my jaw so hard I thought my teeth might crack. This woman, the one I had loved, supported, given my life to, she wasn't even hiding it anymore. The years of manipulation, the slow erosion of my confidence, the belittling, it had all been leading up to this moment. And I had been blind. Get out, she said, taking a step back like my presence was somehow dirtying her space. I have a meeting in the morning, and I'd rather not have my soon-to-be homeless husband lingering around like some stray dog. I exhaled slowly, my mind spinning. But I didn't argue. I didn't yell. I didn't beg. Instead, I reached for my suitcase, my fingers brushing over the old leather handle. And I smiled. It was small, almost imperceptible, but Bianca caught it. Her expression flickered, just for a second. She thought she had won. She had no idea what was coming. The night air was sharp as I stepped outside, my breath curling in front of me in ghostly wisps. The weight of the suitcase in my hand felt heavier than it should have, but not because of what was inside. It was the weight of betrayal. The weight of years wasted on a woman who had just thrown me away like garbage. Behind me, the door slammed shut. Loud. Final. I stood there for a moment, staring at the house, my mother's house, the home I had grown up in, the place where she had cooked Sunday dinners, where she had hugged me after my first heartbreak, where she had spent her final days. And now, that woman, Bianca, was inside, probably pouring herself a glass of expensive wine, basking in what she thought was her victory. I turned and walked to my truck. I didn't speed off in a rage, didn't punch the steering wheel or scream into the empty night. No. I sat there, my fingers drumming against the leather wheel, my pulse slow, steady. I had learned a long time ago that real power wasn't in screaming. It was in silence, in waiting. And I could wait. The next few days passed in a blur. I stayed in a cheap motel on the edge of town, eating greasy diner food, keeping my phone on silent. I didn't call Bianca. She didn't call me. Why would she? In her mind, I was already gone. Erased. Then, on the fourth day, I got the call. A smooth, professional voice came through the receiver. Mr. Moreau? This is Jonathan Klein's office. Your presence is required for the reading of Eleanor Morrow's will. Please be at our firm at 10 a.m. sharp tomorrow." I smiled. Right on schedule. The next morning, I arrived at Klein and Hartman dressed in a crisp navy suit. I wasn't the broken man Bianca had tossed out of the house. No, I had spent the last few nights preparing myself for what was coming. The receptionist, a woman with short blonde hair and a stiff smile, led me to a mahogany-paneled conference room. My heart gave a slow, deliberate beat when I saw her. Bianca. She was sitting at the table, dressed in one of her signature white blazers, her diamond earrings catching the light. She was poised, elegant, every bit the woman she had worked so hard to become, the woman who had planned for this moment. Her eyes flicked up to me. Something passed over her face. Confusion? Annoyance? Maybe even nerves. She hadn't expected me to show up. I sat down across from her, resting my hands on the table. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The lawyer, an older man with sharp eyes and a gray suit, cleared his throat and shuffled a stack of papers. "Let's begin." Bianca leaned back in her chair, crossing her legs, looking utterly relaxed. Of course, she was. In her mind, this was just a formality. The house, the accounts, the assets, it was already hers. She was already celebrating. I turned my gaze to the lawyer, my heartbeat steady. She was in for a surprise. The air in the conference room was thick with quiet tension. The lawyer adjusted his glasses, flipping through the thick stack of papers in front of him. I could feel Bianca's confidence radiating off her like a perfume, her smug little smirk, the way she drummed her manicured nails against the polished oak table. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't anxious. She was waiting to win. Jonathan Klein cleared his throat and began. "We are gathered here today for the official reading of the last will and testament of Eleanor Morrow." His voice was smooth, professional, and unaffected by the tension crackling in the room. The assets to be distributed include a primary residence valued at approximately $1 million, various bank accounts, investment portfolios, and the Morrow antique collection. At the mention of the house's value, Bianca's smirk deepened. She was barely paying attention, her posture screaming boredom, as if this was just a dull formality before she got what she believed was already hers. I said nothing. I just watched. Jonathan continued reading, detailing minor bequests, donations to charity, small sums left to distant relatives. Bianca's foot tapped impatiently under the table. She didn't care about any of that. She was waiting for the real prize. Then, finally, the moment came. And now, the primary inheritance, including the house at 271 Oakwood Lane, all financial accounts, stock portfolios, and remaining liquid assets, will be left to you. He paused, glancing at Bianca. She smiled, already reaching for the metaphorical golden ticket. "My beloved son, Vincent Morrow." The room dropped into a vacuum of silence. Bianca's smile froze. Her fingers, which had been resting on the table with such poised arrogance, twitched. She blinked. Once. Twice. Then she laughed. A short, breathy chuckle as if she had misheard. "I'm sorry. What?" she said, tilting her head at the lawyer. "That's a mistake." Jonathan didn't even blink. "There's no mistake, Mrs. Morrow." Her expression cracked. The blood drained from her face so fast I thought she might pass out. "No," she said sharply, sitting up straight, her smirk gone. "That can't be right. That house is mine. I live there. The deed was in Eleanor Morrow's name." Jonathan cut in, his voice calm, factual, deadly. "And as per her legally documented wishes, it is now the sole property of Vincent Morrow." Bianca's mouth opened, but no sound came out. She turned to me. For the first time since I had walked into the room, she really looked at me. I leaned back in my chair, watching her with something close to amusement. I didn't gloat. I didn't smile. I just waited. Her breathing turned shallow. This is ridiculous. I was his wife. I was the one taking care of things, handling the estate, making sure. Jonathan didn't let her finish. "Mrs. Morrow," he said smoothly, flipping to the next page of the will, "your name is mentioned in the document. However, Eleanor Morrow left explicit instructions that you receive exactly. He glanced down at the page. I saw it before he even said it. $1. Bianca gasped. Her body lurched forward, her hands slamming onto the table. What? She shrieked, her voice bouncing off the walls. Jonathan remained impassive. $1, he repeated, sliding the paper across the table. A symbolic amount, as per Eleanor's personal wishes. Bianca stared at the page as if it had personally slapped her. Her hands trembled. Her eyes darted wildly over the lines, desperate for some loophole, some mistake. But there was none. The house wasn't hers. The money wasn't hers. She had nothing. I exhaled slowly, then leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. You have 24 hours, I said quietly, my voice calm, almost kind, to pack your things and get out of my house. Her head snapped toward me, her face twisted in a mask of disbelief and pure, unfiltered rage. And for the first time since this all started, I saw something new in her eyes. Fear. Bianca's breath hitched, her face turning a shade of pale I had never seen before. The confidence, the smug superiority, it all crumbled before my eyes. She wasn't winning anymore. Her hands gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white. This is a joke, she whispered, shaking her head. She turned to Jonathan, her voice rising. You're lying. There has to be a mistake. Check it again. Jonathan, as composed as ever, merely adjusted his glasses and tapped the document in front of her. Mrs. Morrow, this will was notarized, reviewed, and executed under strict legal procedures. There are no mistakes. Everything was left to Vincent. You were left a single symbolic $1. That is final. A tremor ran through her body. Then, in an instant, the fear in her eyes was replaced by something sharper, deadlier. Rage. She let out a sharp, humorless laugh and turned back to me. Her lip curled as she spat. You think this changes anything? You pathetic idiot. You wouldn't even know how to handle that kind of money. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger at me, would be nothing without me. I tilted my head slightly, considering her words. Then I smiled. A slow, measured, knowing smile. Then it's a good thing I don't need you, isn't it? Her face twisted into something monstrous. She lunged across the table, her nails practically clawing the polished surface, as if she could physically snatch the inheritance away from me. I built that house, she shrieked. I deserve it. I sacrificed for you. I am the reason you had a life worth living. The sheer audacity of it almost made me laugh. I didn't flinch, didn't react. I just watched her unravel. Jonathan, however, cleared his throat, setting the final nail in her coffin. Mrs. Morrow, I'd advise you to control yourself. This is a formal legal proceeding. Her chest rose and fell rapidly, her eyes darting between me and the lawyer like a trapped animal looking for an escape. But there was none. She had lost. Still, Bianca wasn't the type to go down without a fight. She slammed her fists against the table and laughed again. A bitter, hollow sound. Fine, she spat, pushing herself back into her seat. Fine. You want your stupid house? Take it. She grabbed her purse, shoving it against her side, her nostrils flaring. But you better believe I'm not leaving without a fight. You think I'll just roll over and let you take everything? I'll contest this. I'll get my lawyers. You have no idea who you're messing with, Vincent. I didn't answer. I just reached into my jacket pocket, pulled out my own folded document, and placed it on the table in front of her. She frowned, her fingers twitching before snatching it up. Her eyes darted across the words. Then she froze. Her entire body stilled. Slowly, so very slowly, she lifted her gaze to me, her expression shifting into something close to horror. I leaned in slightly, my voice calm. Steady. I knew you'd try this, Bianca, I murmured. I knew you'd fight. That's why I had a forensic accountant go through every single transaction you've made in the last 5 years. Every transfer. Every hidden account. Every little secret you thought I'd never find. Her lips parted, but no words came out. I held her gaze. I have everything. The hidden money. The personal withdrawals from my accounts. The funds you funneled into your private projects, and all the proof that you planned to divorce me the second my mother was gone. She gasped. I let the weight of my words sink in before I finished. So go ahead, Bianca. Contest the will. But if you do, all of this goes public. And I promise you, the courts won't look too kindly on a woman who spent years financially bleeding her husband dry while lying through her teeth. She swallowed hard, her pupils blown wide. For the first time in our entire marriage, Bianca Morrow was speechless. And I? I sat back in my chair and enjoyed the moment. Bianca's breathing was ragged, her manicured fingers gripping the edges of the document so tightly I thought she might tear it apart with sheer force of will. But no amount of rage, no amount of scheming, could change what was written in cold, undeniable ink. She had been caught. I watched her carefully, taking in the flickers of emotion that crossed her face. Fury, fear, desperation. She opened her mouth once, twice, like a fish gasping for air, but no words came out. Jonathan Klein leaned back in his chair, his hands folded neatly over his notes, watching Bianca with mild amusement. He had probably seen this scene play out 100 times before. A greedy spouse blindsided by a will they had never bothered to check. But there was one difference. Most people didn't come to these meetings thinking they had already won. Bianca's gaze snapped back to me, eyes wild. You set me up. I arched an eyebrow. You set yourself up. She bared her teeth, leaning forward, her voice a low, venomous hiss. You think you're smart, Vincent? You think this little trick will stop me? I smiled. It's not a trick, Bianca. It's justice. Her lips twisted into a snarl. You smug, pathetic little. Jonathan cleared his throat loudly, cutting her off. Mrs. Morrow, I would advise you to keep your composure. This is still an official legal proceeding, and I will ask security to remove you if necessary. She shot him a look so full of venom I half expected him to drop dead on the spot. But it didn't matter. She had lost control. She turned back to me, her hands shaking. What do you want? She spat. I shrugged. It's simple. You have 24 hours to pack your things and leave the house. My house. You do that, and I won't move forward with pressing charges for financial fraud. I won't release the evidence to the media. I won't even tell your precious, high-society clients that their favorite event planner is a liar and a thief. Her nostrils flared. She knew I wasn't bluffing. She knew. You son of a... I stood up, adjusting my suit jacket. Careful, Bianca, I said smoothly. You don't want to spend your last few minutes in this office making more mistakes. Her whole body trembled. Not with sadness. Not with remorse. With rage. I turned to Jonathan. I assume everything is in order? He nodded, collecting the documents. Everything is legally binding. Mrs. Morrow has no claim to the estate. If she refuses to leave within 24 hours, we will proceed with formal eviction procedures. Bianca let out a strangled noise, somewhere between a growl and a sob. You're making a huge mistake, Vincent, she hissed. I smiled at her. No, Bianca, I said softly. The only mistake I ever made was marrying you. And with that, I turned and walked out of the room, leaving her there, powerless for the first time in her life. I stepped out of the law firm and into the crisp morning air, inhaling deeply. The weight that had been pressing on my chest for years was gone. No more whispered manipulations, no more walking on eggshells in my own home, no more pretending that Bianca was anything other than a predator in designer heels. She was finished. As I reached my truck, I glanced at my watch. 10:45. That gave her exactly 23 hours and 15 minutes to get out of my house. My house. I climbed into the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel for a long moment before allowing myself a single, deep laugh. Not because it was funny, because it was over. I had wasted too many years thinking I was the problem. Thinking if I just worked harder, if I just gave her everything, if I just became the husband she wanted, things would get better. But Bianca had never loved me. She had loved what I could give her. I put the truck in drive and pulled away from the curb, my destination already set in my mind. The house. I needed to see it with fresh eyes. Not as the place where Bianca lorded over me, treating me like an inconvenience in my own home. not as the battleground where she stripped away my confidence piece by piece. No, I needed to see it as mine again. When I pulled into the driveway, I half expected to see Bianca waiting, arms crossed, ready to launch into another tirade. But the house was quiet. Too quiet. I stepped out and approached the front door, my key still in my pocket. When I reached for the handle, I hesitated. Would she have changed the locks? I slid the key in and turned. Click. The door swung open without resistance. I exhaled sharply, stepping inside. The scent of her expensive perfume still lingered in the air, something artificial and overpowering, like everything else about her. I walked through the living room, my eyes scanning the space. Everything was exactly as she had left it. The silk throw pillows she had insisted on. The ridiculous glass coffee table she claimed was modern elegance. The furniture she had picked out, not for comfort, but for status. It wasn't a home. It was a trophy case, and I had been the fool who thought I belonged in it. I ran my fingers over the edge of the antique cabinet near the fireplace. One of my mother's pieces. The craftsmanship, the care, it was built to last. Unlike Bianca's disposable, soulless decor. A bitter smile touched my lips. She had always looked down on my work, sneering at my passion for restoration. It's old, Vincent. Why waste your time on something that's already broken? Because some things are worth saving. Unlike her, a sharp noise from upstairs snapped me out of my thoughts. A rustling. I turned my head slowly, every muscle in my body tensing. Was she still here? I climbed the stairs cautiously, my footsteps barely making a sound. When I reached the master bedroom, the door was ajar. And inside, standing in front of the open closet, was Bianca. She was shoving clothes into a suitcase, moving frantically, her phone clutched in her other hand. She hadn't noticed me yet. I leaned against the doorframe and cleared my throat. Her entire body jerked. The phone clattered to the floor as she whirled around, her face going from shock to fury in a heartbeat. "What the hell are you doing here?" she snapped. I crossed my arms, tilting my head slightly. "I believe I told you to be out in 24 hours. Not 24 minutes. She bared her teeth, her hands curling into fists. "You don't get to breathe down my neck while I pack, Vincent. This is harassment." I chuckled, low and slow. "Harassment? That's funny. You had no problem throwing me out of my own home. Remember that." Her eyes darkened. I took a single step inside, lowering my voice just enough to make sure she felt every word. "You should be grateful I'm letting you walk out of here with your reputation intact." She scoffed, tossing a handful of jewelry into her bag. "Don't act like some noble hero, Vincent. You think you've won? I'll land on my feet. I always do." I smiled. "Sure, maybe some poor bastard will fall for your act. But you and I both know you've lost." Her jaw tightened. For the first time, I saw something flicker in her eyes that wasn't rage or arrogance. Panic. She knew she had nowhere to go. She knew she had nothing. And that was the best damn feeling in the world. Bianca's hands trembled as she yanked open another dresser drawer, stuffing clothes inside with wild, jerky movements. Her breathing was sharp, uneven. She was trying, desperately trying, to keep up the facade, to cling to that last shred of control. But it was slipping through her fingers like sand. I just stood there, arms crossed, watching her fall apart. "Where are you going to go, Bianca?" I asked, my voice calm, almost conversational. "Back to your penthouse dreams? Or will you call up one of your little business contacts and beg for a place to crash?" She whirled around, eyes blazing. "I don't need your pity, Vincent." I chuckled. "Pity? No, sweetheart. Pity would be offering you a second chance. Pity would be helping you pack." I took a slow step forward, lowering my voice. "And I think we both know I'm fresh out of pity." Her throat bobbed as she swallowed. For the first time since I met her, she wasn't in control. And she felt it. I leaned against the doorframe, watching her scramble, tossing expensive handbags into her open suitcase, grabbing anything she could carry. "You really thought you had it all figured out, didn't you?" I mused. The perfect con. Marry the quiet guy with the family money. wait until my mother was gone, then push me out like I was just some unwanted guest in my own home. I let my head tilt slightly. You really thought I was that stupid? She snapped. Shut up, she screamed, her voice raw with rage. She threw one of her designer heels at me. I sidestepped it easily, watching it crash against the doorframe. Temper, temper, I murmured. Her chest heaved. You think this is over? She seethed. You think you can just throw me out like trash? I made you. She pointed a shaking finger at me. I gave you status. I gave you a name. I turned you into someone who mattered. I laughed. A real, deep laugh. You gave me nothing. I took another step forward, making her take a hesitant step back. You drained my accounts. You turned my home into your personal showroom. You humiliated me in front of your friends. And worst of all, you thought I'd just sit back and take it forever. Her lips parted, but she had no comeback. Because she knew I was right. I exhaled, shaking my head. You never really saw me, did you, Bianca? You thought I was some weak, naive fool. Someone you could control. I glanced around the room, at the mess of half-packed bags and abandoned shoes. But look at you now. She said nothing. I could see it sinking in. The full, ugly weight of reality. Her safety net was gone. The cushy lifestyle, the parties, the effortless shopping sprees. Gone. And for the first time in her life, Bianca Moreau had nowhere to land. She took a deep, shuddering breath, her eyes flicking toward me with something almost desperate. Vincent, she said, her voice suddenly softer. Please, we don't have to do this. I smiled. There it was. The final play. The last, desperate move of a woman who knew she had lost. You want to talk now? I asked. Now that you don't have any cards left to play? She stepped toward me, her voice taking on that familiar, syrupy sweetness. We don't have to end this like enemies, she murmured, her fingers grazing my arm. We had something, Vincent. I mean, you loved me once, right? I tilted my head, pretending to consider it. Then I reached up and gently removed her hand from my sleeve. I love the idea of you, I said simply. But the real you? I smiled coldly. I don't even like you. Her entire face crumbled. I stepped back, glancing at my watch. 22 hours left, I said casually. Better get packing. Then I turned and walked out, leaving her standing there in the ruins of her perfect plan. I didn't look back as I walked down the stairs, but I felt Bianca's rage burning behind me. That woman had spent her entire life bending people to her will, twisting the world to suit her needs. And now? Now she had nothing. I stepped into the kitchen, grabbing a glass from the cupboard. I turned on the tap, letting the water run cold before filling the glass and taking a long, slow sip. The irony wasn't lost on me. This was the first time in years I felt like I could just exist in my own home. No sneering remarks about my cheap work clothes. No passive-aggressive complaints about how my clutter was ruining the decor. Just silence. And damn, it felt good. A loud thud echoed from upstairs. I smirked against the rim of my glass. She was throwing things now. Maybe breaking a few. Typical. I wouldn't be surprised if she thought destroying some of my belongings would make her feel better. Let her. She could shatter every overpriced vase in this house, and it still wouldn't change the fact that by this time tomorrow, she'd be gone. As I set the glass down on the counter, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out and glanced at the screen. Unknown number. I frowned but answered. Yeah. Silence on the other end. Then a low male voice. You really screwed up, man. My fingers tightened around the phone. Who the hell is this? A slow chuckle. Let's just say, you don't want to make enemies with the wrong people. The line went dead. I lowered the phone, my jaw clenching. What the hell was that? I turned, staring up at the ceiling where Bianca was still moving around upstairs. Did she seriously just send someone to threaten me? I shouldn't have been surprised. Bianca wasn't the type to go down quietly. If she had any connections left, she'd be calling in favors, trying to fix this. Maybe she thought she could intimidate me into backing down, scare me into letting her stay. Big mistake. I pressed my lips together, took one last sip of water, and set the glass in the sink. Then, with a calm, measured pace, I walked back upstairs. Bianca was in the walk-in closet, frantically yanking dresses off their hangers and shoving them into her suitcase. Her movements were jerky, erratic. She was unraveling. She spun around the second she saw me. "What now?" she snapped. I studied her for a long moment, then leaned against the doorframe. "Just got an interesting phone call," I said. "Someone telling me I screwed up." Her expression flickered, just for a second, but I caught it. A flash of something guilty. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said quickly, turning back to her packing. I stepped further into the room. "Don't play dumb, Bianca. You and I both know you don't go down without a fight. So tell me," I lowered my voice. "Who did you call?" She whirled around, eyes wide. "You're paranoid," she snapped. "Why the hell would I waste my time calling anyone about you?" I chuckled, shaking my head. "See, that's the thing. You're too proud to beg, too entitled to accept defeat, and too damn spiteful to let me win without throwing one last punch." I took another step forward, my voice dropping to a near whisper. "So I'll ask you again. Who did you call?" Her jaw tightened. And then, for the first time since this started, Bianca made a mistake. She looked away. Not just anywhere. Down. Right at her phone, which was still lying face down on the dresser. "Gotcha." I walked past her, plucked the phone off the dresser, and held it up. "Let's see who's been helping you," I mused, unlocking the screen. She lunged for it, but I stepped back just in time, raising my arm out of reach. "Vincent, don't." I scrolled through her recent calls, and there it was. A familiar number. I felt my stomach tighten as I read the name attached to it. Bianca went pale. "It's not what you think," she whispered. But it was exactly what I thought. Because the number she had called belonged to my late mother's financial advisor. Bianca hadn't just been desperate. She had been plotting something long before today. I turned the phone toward her, letting her see exactly what I was looking at. Bianca's breath caught in her throat, her hands balling into fists at her sides. For the first time since this all started, she looked scared. "You want to explain why you were calling my mother's financial advisor 2 weeks before she passed?" My voice was dangerously calm, but inside, a storm was brewing. She shook her head, lips parting, searching for an excuse, some quick, clever lie that could get her out of this. But she wasn't quick enough. "Vincent, it's not what you think," she whispered. I laughed, a slow, humorless chuckle. "Oh, I think it's exactly what I think. So why don't you go ahead and say it?" I took a step forward, lowering my voice. "Say what you did, Bianca." Her eyes darted toward the doorway, like a trapped animal looking for an escape. But there was nowhere to go. She swallowed hard. "I was just making sure everything was in order. Your mother wasn't doing well, and you thought you'd help yourself to her money?" I cut in, my voice sharp. She flinched. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to stay calm. I had to be smart. Bianca wasn't just a liar. She was a master manipulator. If I let myself get too angry, too emotional, she'd find a way to turn this around. So I took a breath, and I smiled. "You thought you were ahead of me this whole time," I said softly. "You thought you were playing chess while I was playing checkers. But tell me, Bianca, how's that working out for you now?" She snapped. "I deserve that money," she screamed, her face twisting with rage. "I spent years dealing with your pathetic family, listening to your mother look down on me like I was some nobody. I was the one who made our life worth living, Vincent. She froze, realizing she had said too much. Her eyes widened slightly, as if she could shove the words back into her mouth. I exhaled through my nose, my fists clenching at my sides. "So it wasn't enough that you drained my accounts behind my back," I murmured. "You had to try and steal from my mother too?" She swallowed, eyes darting to the phone still clutched in my hand. "Vincent, please." I stepped back, shaking my head slowly. "You're done, Bianca. Really done." And then I pressed a button on her phone. Her entire body went rigid, because the screen lit up, and it was dialing the last number she called. A few rings. Then, "Hello." A deep voice, professional and calm. The financial advisor. I lifted the phone to my ear. "Hey, Daniel," I said casually, watching Bianca's world crumble in real time. A pause. Then, a cautious, "Vincent? Didn't expect to hear from you. What's going on?" I glanced at Bianca, her breathing shallow, her eyes desperate. "I was hoping you could clear something up for me," I said, my voice smooth, cold. "Because it looks like my wife's been calling you a lot lately." Silence on the other end. Then, Daniel sighed. A deep, weary sigh. "Vincent, I was wondering when you'd find out." My grip on the phone tightened. That told me everything. I stepped even closer to Bianca, lowering my voice to a near whisper. "What did she do?" Bianca shook her head wildly, panicking now. "Vincent, hang up. Please, But Daniel had already started talking, and what he said made my blood turn to ice. Daniel hesitated for only a moment before exhaling sharply. Then, in a low, deliberate voice, he said words that sent a bolt of pure rage through my veins. "Vincent, your wife tried to have your mother declared mentally incompetent before she passed." The room tilted. I blinked, my grip on the phone tightening so hard my knuckles went white. "What?" Daniel's voice remained steady, but there was something bitter beneath it. 2 months before Eleanor passed, Bianca contacted me. She wanted to start the process of having your mother declared unfit to manage her own finances. Claimed she was losing touch with reality and making reckless decisions. She even hired a psychiatrist to back up her claim. I turned my head slowly toward Bianca. She was frozen. Her lips trembled, her entire body locked in place like a cornered animal. "She wanted power of attorney," Daniel continued. "She was planning to take over everything before your mother even passed. Vincent. The house, the accounts, the stocks. All of it." I felt my heart pounding against my ribs. "Why didn't she succeed?" I asked, my voice eerily calm. Daniel let out a low chuckle, dark and knowing. "Because Eleanor wasn't as easy to manipulate as Bianca thought." A pause. "She saw this coming, Vincent. She knew what your wife was." My throat went tight. "Your mother had already met with me privately, months before Bianca ever made that call. She knew Bianca was circling, waiting to strike. That's why she updated her will and put in those legal protections. She made sure that when she passed, there would be no loopholes, no way for Bianca to steal what wasn't hers." I closed my eyes for a brief moment, my chest aching. She knew. My mother knew. And she had protected me. Even in her final days, even while she was sick, she was fighting for me. I swallowed hard and opened my eyes. Bianca hadn't moved. Her hands were trembling now, her breathing shallow, her face ashen. Daniel cleared his throat on the other end. "I wanted to tell you earlier, Vincent, but legally, my hands were tied unless you brought it up first. Now that it's out in the open, if you want to pursue legal action, you'd have a case." I glanced at Bianca, at the sheer terror written across her face. For the first time, she wasn't playing games. She wasn't in control. She knew exactly what I could do to her with this information. I let the silence stretch between us, watching her unravel before my eyes. Then, I lifted the phone back to my ear. "Thanks, Daniel," I said smoothly. "I'll be in touch." I ended the call. The second the line went dead, Bianca exploded. "Vincent, please." She lunged for me, grabbing at my arm, her nails digging into my sleeve. I only did it because I was scared. Your mother never liked me. She was going to cut me out. I had no choice." I laughed. A sharp, dangerous laugh. "No choice." I echoed. "You tried to have my mother legally stripped of her rights while she was dying, Bianca. You tried to steal everything before she was even in the ground. And you think you can stand here and tell me you had no choice?" She was shaking now. Her perfectly curated mask of arrogance and control had shattered. "I'll do anything," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Please, just don't take this to court. Don't ruin me, Vincent." I studied her for a long moment. Then, finally, I spoke. "You have 12 hours. She blinked, confused. What? "You're leaving my house tonight. Not tomorrow. Not in 24 hours. Tonight." My voice was sharp, final. "And if you're not gone by midnight, I'll make sure this goes public. I'll take every piece of evidence I have, and I will bury you." Her breath hitched. "You wouldn't," she whispered. I stepped closer, lowering my voice so she could feel every single word. "Try me." She crumbled. The fight left her body in a shuddering exhale, her hands dropping to her sides. For the first time in her life, Bianca Moreau had nothing left to say. Bianca stood there, trembling, her face pale as if the life had been drained from it. The woman who had spent years tearing me down, manipulating, scheming, she was nothing more than a cornered rat now. And she knew it. I didn't have to say anything else. I had already won. Without another word, I turned on my heel and walked out of the bedroom, leaving her standing in the wreckage of her own downfall. By the time I reached the bottom of the stairs, I could already hear the frantic rustling of suitcases, the hurried movements of a woman who had been given her final warning. I grabbed a beer from the fridge, popped the cap, and leaned against the counter, taking a slow sip as I listened to the chaos unfolding upstairs. The sound of drawers slamming, the desperate zip of luggage, the occasional muttered curse under her breath. She was packing like her life depended on it. Good. It did. The hours passed in silence. Bianca never came back downstairs to beg or plead again. She knew there was no saving this. At exactly 11:57 p.m., I heard the front door open. Then footsteps. I turned my head just in time to see Bianca standing in the doorway, dragging her last suitcase behind her. She looked different now, smaller, weaker, stripped of the confidence she had once worn like armor. Her lips parted like she wanted to say something, but then she saw my expression. She shut her mouth. Smart. Without another word, she stepped out onto the porch, the night swallowing her whole. And then, for the last time, I shut the door in Bianca Moreau's face. I stood there for a long moment, gripping the doorknob, feeling the weight of everything. The years of lies, the manipulation, the slow, poisonous way she had crept into my life, making me believe I wasn't enough, that I needed her. I had been blind, but not anymore. I exhaled, my grip loosening. I turned away from the door, stepping back into the house that was mine again. The silence was different now. For the first time in years, it wasn't suffocating. It was peace. And as I took another slow sip of my beer, I let myself do something I hadn't done in a long time. I smiled.